About 2 days after I filmed that protest, the FBI showed up at my house and asked a bunch of questions and wanted to obtain a copy of the full tape.
Even after the FBI's subpoenas, Josh Wolf acted like a journalist and refused to turn over his sources. For this, he was sentenced to prison.
I figured it would be the journalists spend the night in jail and they decided to drop the subpoena afterwards.
This wasn't the case.
You're taken by U.S. Marshals from a courtroom, forced to strip down to absolutely nothing, handcuffs in the front, a chain around my waist tied to my feet. I remember seeing this very large guy, giant guy, shaved head, tattoos, looked completely scary as all can be. He's like, "So what are you in here for?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm a journalist that refused to provide tape and testify before a grand jury about protesters." And he's like, "So you're here for not snitching? That's amazingly cool, man." He's like, "Be sure to tell people about that. You'll get respect. You won't have anything to worry about." And I'm like, "All right, note to self, I'm here for not snitching."
Josh served 226 days in an 8 by 10-foot cell. His sentence was longer than that for any journalist in U.S. history.
The real risk, the real frightening fact was that the federal government was trying to obtain the identities of people who don't support what this government is doing, and using a journalist as an agent, a de facto agent, to do it.
When I was speaking to intelligence officials about WMD in Iraq, they were willing to speak precisely because they knew that I would protect that confidentiality. And when you lose that ability to guarantee somebody's, to protect your sources, then you lose that information. Ultimately, it's the public as a whole that loses.
Gentlemen being arrested, and there are a lot of us, but what the fuck? Look at that!
The ninth step is to recast criticism as espionage and dissent as treason, and you see this more and more. Remember, Senator Clinton criticized the Iraq War, and there was this drumbeat, treason, treason, treason. But you start to see in a closing society more and more laws criminalizing speech.
Please, the Bill of Rights get closed. Thank you.
We already saw the White House use laws to silence dissent. If you're charged with the Espionage Act, you can be sent to prison for 10 years. If you're charged with treason, you can be executed. But even scarier are new laws. One that's been passed redefines protest as terrorism, and another that's been proposed simply criminalizes free speech. At the Republican National Convention in St. Paul in 2008, 400 American citizens were arrested for protesting. Over 100 were charged with felonies, and dozens of reporters were arrested.
Release the accredited journalist now!
From the convention
You are violating my constitutional rights. You are violating now.
Sir, I want to talk to you. Do not arrest me.
Your rights, sir.
Stay right there. You're not under arrest. Stay right there. Back up, back up.
Among those reporters arrested was Amy Goodman, journalist and host of the program Democracy Now!
Amy, we're going to get you out of here very soon. Yes.
In a nearby park, there was a mass arrest of more than 200 people who weren't even part of the convention protests.
You know, we knew that we hadn't done anything wrong. No one was really even holding signs. No one was really even demonstrating. We were all just hanging out. Out of nowhere, the police tightened in, and everyone's kind of getting nervous at this point. And they get on the bullhorn and they say, "Ladies and gentlemen, you're all under arrest." I'm seeing families and you know, kids with University of Minnesota shirts and and at that point, no one really believed it. But then as they started slowly moving in, it became real clear that this was a mass arrest and that they were going to arrest people without any any probable cause, without witnessing any sort of crime other than hanging out in a park.
Under the Minnesota Patriot Act, 8 American citizens protesting the convention were later charged with terrorism.
Get back,
H.R. 1955, which blessedly hasn't passed so far, partly because we've been out there beating the drum about it. It was a bill with lots of support, passed in the House, on the way to the Senate, which would basically criminalize this conversation, because it was so loosely worded that it criminalized any advocacy of the use of force against the government. Now, this is right out of Stalin's playbook. It was so loosely worded that if you say, as I'm going to say at the end of this, we need to investigate and prosecute anyone who's committed crimes in the White House, that's criminal. And it would implicate you, by the way, as being supporters of criminalized speech. And that is the hallmark of a closing society, because there's now an effort afoot to recast anyone who's critical of the state as a terrorist.
Some members of Congress want to know why President Bush claims he can sometimes just ignore the law if he feels like it.
This president's theory of his power is now, I think, so extreme that it's unprecedented. He believes that he has the inherent authority to violate federal law.
Step 10 is the subversion of the rule of law. You saw it in Italy very clearly. Mussolini just started to ignore Parliament. But Parliament kept saying, hey, we're Parliament. You can't just ignore us. Is this sounding familiar? Yeah. So at this stage, you start to see what we're seeing now, which is Congress subpoenas Harriet Miers and Josh Bolton, and the White House says, sorry, too bad. So under the rule of law, that's contempt of Congress, and it's illegal, right? But Congress is like, no, 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 you don't understand. We're Congress. And the White House is whatever. The Attorney General scandal, the U.S. Attorney scandal. Remember that?
There was a request from the White House as to the possibility of replacing all the United States attorneys.
When I was first reading about it, there were 8 or 9 U.S. attorneys that had been targeted to be moved out. And I was reading Goebbels, so I thought, I bet they tried to purge them all. And sure enough, the missing emails that we can't surface, they're gone, would show testimony proves that there was discussion about purging all the U.S. attorneys at once. So why is this relevant? Again, in 1933, this very critical year, in 1 month, Goebbels purged all the attorneys and the judges, and he replaced them with his own guys. Once you do that, you can still have elections. You can still have a judiciary. You just don't have freedom. The president, with signing statements, which he's used more than any other president, basically says, sorry, Congress, I don't care what you think.
Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Arlen Specter is holding hearings on Mr. Bush's use of something called bill signing statements. The president reserves the right to revise, interpret, or disregard a measure on national security or constitutional grounds. President Bush has done this 110 times to challenge 750 separate laws passed by the Congress.
The signing statements represent a fundamental failure of the Congress to utilize its constitutional authority, and the widespread practice has now come into play where the president signs and issues a signing statement undercutting key provisions of the legislation.
We're really at a point where the president is arguing about his own presidential power in ways that are the antithesis of that Constitution and the values that it contains.
So at the last stage, you start to see this just flat-out subversion of the rule of law, or making it easier to declare martial law.